The fever had taken hold of Lisa 3 days ago, and Mira watched helplessly as her younger sister's breathing grew more labored with each passing hour. The village healer had tried everything: willow bark tea, cold compresses, even the precious herbs imported from the capital, but nothing stemmed the sickness that seemed to drain the very life from Lisa's small frame. Her once rosy cheeks had turned ashen, and her lips held a blue tinge that made Mira's heart clench with terror. "Please," Mira whispered, pressing a damp cloth to Lisa's burning forehead. "Please don't leave me." She was all Mira had left in this world, the only family remaining after their parents had perished in the plague 5 winters past. At 19, Mira had become mother, father, and protector to her 13-year-old sister, working their small plot of land and taking in mending to keep them fed and sheltered. The cottage door creaked open, and Elder Thorn stepped inside without invitation, his weathered face grave beneath his hood. Behind him stood 2 other village elders, their expressions equally somber. Mira's stomach dropped as she recognized the look in their eyes, the same expression they'd worn when they'd come to tell the baker his wife wouldn't survive childbirth, when they'd informed the miller that his son had drowned in the river. "Child," Elder Thorn said softly, removing his hood to reveal sparse gray hair, "we've done all we can. The sickness that grips young Lisa is beyond our healing. You must prepare yourself for— No." The word tore from Mira's throat with surprising force. She stood from her vigil beside Lisa's bed, her hands clenched into fists. There has to be something else. Some other remedy, some other healer in a neighboring village, Mira. Elder Thorn's voice carried the weight of years and loss. "We've sent word to every healer within 3 days' ride. This fever, it's the same that took the Brennan children last spring. There is no cure known to mortal medicine." Mortal medicine. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Mira felt something desperate and reckless kindle in her chest. She had heard the stories, the whispered tales passed down through generations of villagers who spoke in hushed tones around winter fires. Stories of the Elderwood Forest that lay beyond the northern ridge, where ancient magic still thrummed beneath moss-covered stones and twisted trees. "What about the forest?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Elderwood. They say it holds old magic, powerful healing. They say it's cursed," Elder Thorn interrupted sharply. "They say no one who enters ever returns. Those are the tales of desperate fools, child. The Elderwood is forbidden for good reason." But Mira's mind was already racing, remembering fragments of stories her grandmother had told before her death. Tales of travelers who had found miraculous cures within the forest depths, of springs that could heal any ailment, of ancient powers that slumbered beneath the canopy. Most dismissed these as mere folklore, but what if there was truth buried within the legends? How many have actually tried? Mira challenged, lifting her chin defiantly. How many have gone seeking healing rather than treasure or adventure? Elder Thorn's expression hardened. "Enough have vanished that we declared the forest forbidden generations ago. I'll not have another young life lost to such foolishness." After the others departed with stern warnings and promises to return in the morning to help with preparations for the inevitable, Mira sat alone with her sister in the gathering dusk. Lisa's breathing had grown so shallow that Mira had to lean close to her chest to confirm she still lived. Time was running out, measured in heartbeats that grew fainter with each passing moment. The decision crystallized in Mira's mind with startling clarity. She would not sit here and watch her sister die while potentially life-saving magic lay just beyond their reach. The elders spoke of curses and disappearances, but they offered no alternative save acceptance of death. That was a surrender Mira refused to make. Moving quietly through the cottage, she gathered supplies by candlelight: her father's hunting knife, a water skin, dried bread and cheese, a thick woolen cloak. She wrapped Lisa carefully in warm furs and lifted her sister's frail form, amazed at how light she had become. Even unconscious, Lisa's head lolled against Mira's shoulder, and her breath came in rapid, shallow puffs. The path to the Elderwood was treacherous in daylight, and potentially deadly in darkness, but Mira could not afford to wait until dawn. Every hour might be Lisa's last, and the journey would take most of the night even if she pushed herself to exhaustion. She made the trek to the forest's edge once before as a curious child, though she had heeded her parents' warnings and ventured no further than the outer ring of ancient oaks. The village slept peacefully as Mira made her way through empty streets, Lysa's weight growing heavier with each step. No watchman challenged her passage. The settlement was small and trusted, with little need for night guards. Beyond the last cottage, the dirt road gave way to a narrow hunting trail that wound up into the hills toward the forbidden forest. The moon provided enough light to navigate by, though shadows stretched long and ominous across the rocky path. Mira's legs burned with effort as she climbed steadily upward, pausing frequently to rest and check on Lysa's condition. Her sister remained unconscious but breathing, her fever still raging despite the cool night air. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Mira crested the final ridge and beheld the Elderwood stretching before her like a vast green ocean. The forest was older than memory, its towering trees massive beyond comprehension. Ancient oaks, their trunks wide enough to house families, stood sentinel alongside towering pines and maples whose canopy blocked out most of the sky. Even from the forest's edge, Mira could feel something different about this place, a weight in the air, a sense of vast intelligence watching and waiting. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Mira crossed the threshold into the Elderwood and immediately felt the change. The very air seemed thicker here, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle. The sounds of the outside world, birdsong, wind through grass, the distant lowing of cattle faded abruptly, replaced by a profound silence broken only by the soft whisper of wind through leaves high overhead. The forest floor was carpeted with moss and fallen leaves that muffled her footsteps, creating an almost dreamlike quality to her passage. Ancient stones jutted from the earth at odd intervals, carved with symbols so weathered that their meaning had been lost to time. Some were clearly markers or monuments, while others seemed to pulse with a faint inner light that made Mira's vision blur if she stared too long. Hours passed as she picked her way deeper into the forest, following what might once have been a path but now appeared as little more than a gap between massive tree trunks. Lysa grew heavier in her arms, and Mira's strength began to flag despite her determination. The fever had worsened during the journey, and her sister's breathing had become so faint that Mira feared she might already be too late. Just as despair began to creep into her thoughts, the trees parted to reveal a sight that took her breath away. Before her lay a circular clearing dominated by the ruins of what had once been a magnificent temple. Marble columns, now wrapped in thick vines and moss, supported the remnants of a domed roof, through which shafts of sunlight streamed like divine fingers. The architecture was unlike anything Mira had ever seen, elegant and otherworldly, with flowing lines that seemed to mimic the growth patterns of living trees. At the temple's heart stood a raised dais of white stone, and upon it lay a figure that made Mira's steps falter. A man reclined as if in deepest sleep, his body partially covered by vines and flowering plants that had grown around and through him over what must have been centuries. Yet despite the vegetation that bound him, his form was clearly visible, tall and powerfully built, with features that held an inhuman perfection. His hair was dark as midnight, and his skin bore a pale luminescence that seemed to emanate from within. Most striking were the thorned vines that wound around his wrists, ankles, and throat like shackles, their barbs drawing thin lines of blood that never seemed to dry or heal. The sight filled Mira with an inexplicable sadness, as if she were witnessing a tragedy of cosmic proportions. This was no mere mortal who slumbered here. The very air around him thrummed with barely contained power, and the plants that grew upon the temple steps seemed more vibrant and alive than any she had seen. Lysa stirred weakly in her arms, drawing Mira's attention back to her desperate mission. The temple clearly held ancient magic, and the sleeping figure might be the source of the healing power she sought. Perhaps this was one of the old gods, the beings of legend who had supposedly walked among mortals in ages past before withdrawing from the world. If so, surely such a being would have power over life and death, the ability to turn back sickness and restore vitality. Setting Lysa gently upon the temple steps, Mira approached the dais with a mixture of reverence and desperation. The sleeping figure's chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths, and up close she could see that his features held an ageless quality. He might have been 20 or 2,000 years old. The thorned vines that bound him seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life, their barbs gleaming with an oily darkness that spoke of curses and imprisonment. "Please," Mira whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the ruined temple. If you can hear me, if you have power over life and sickness, my sister is dying. I'll do anything, give anything, if you can save her. The figure remained motionless, lost in whatever dreams or nightmares had held him for countless years. But as Mira knelt beside the dais, she noticed that some of the thorned vines had grown looser over time, their grip weakened by age or some other force. On impulse, she reached out and gently touched one of the vines that crossed his chest, trying to ease its pressure without causing further harm. The moment her fingers made contact with the thorns, several things happened at once. The vine crumbled to dust at her touch, releasing a burst of golden light that spread outward in ripples. The sleeping figure's eyes snapped open, revealing irises of startling emerald green that seemed to hold the depths of ancient forests. And Mira felt a shock of connection, as if lightning had passed between them, carrying with it a flood of emotion and memory that was not her own. Pain. Centuries of pain and rage and terrible loneliness. The memory of betrayal by those he had loved and protected, of being bound and cast into slumber by the very mortals whose lives he had nurtured. The slow dissolution of hope as years turned to decades, decades to centuries, and still no one came to free him from his prison. And beneath it all, a power so vast and primal that it made Mira's consciousness reel the force of life itself, of growth and renewal and the endless cycle of birth and death. The being sat up slowly, the remaining vines falling away like cobwebs, as awareness returned to his features. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder, rich and resonant with barely contained power. Mortal. The word held neither welcome nor hostility, merely acknowledgement. You have awakened me from the long sleep. For what purpose do you disturb my rest? Mira found her voice with difficulty, her throat tight with awe and terror. My sister, she's dying of fever. The healers say there's no cure, but I hoped, that you might have power to save her. The bog god, for what else could he buy, turned his attention to where Lysa lay unconscious on the temple steps. His expression shifted, something almost like compassion flickering across his perfect features. Death comes for all mortals in time. Why should this one be different? Because she's all I have left, Mira said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Because she's only 13 and has barely begun to live. Because... Her voice broke slightly. Because I love her more than my own life, and I would trade anything to see her whole again. The god studied her for a long moment, his green eyes seeming to look straight through her to the truth of her heart. Love, he said finally, and there was something almost wondering in his tone. It has been so long since I have encountered that emotion without deception or calculation behind it. You speak truly, your love for the child burns bright and pure. He rose from the dais with fluid grace, and Mira felt the very air around them come alive with his presence. Plants throughout the temple began to stir and bloom as his power awakened, flowers bursting forth from vines with impossible speed and vibrancy. The crumbling stones seemed to shimmer and solidify, as if the temple itself was remembering its former glory. I am Arion, he said, approaching where Lysa lay. Once mortals knew me as the god of life, guardian of growing things, keeper of the endless cycle. They came to my temples with offerings and prayers, seeking my blessing on their crops and children. His expression darkened. Until fear overcame gratitude, and they decided that gods were too dangerous to walk free among them. Kneeling beside Lysa, Arion placed one hand upon her fevered brow. Golden light flowed from his fingers like liquid sunlight, and immediately the child's breathing deepened and steadied. Color returned to her pale cheeks, and the terrible stillness that had gripped her small form gave way to the natural rest of healthy sleep. She will live, Arion said simply, sitting back on his heels. The fever is broken, the sickness burned away, but the healing has cost me much. My power is not what it once was, weakened by centuries of binding and forced slumber. Mira fell to her knees beside her sister, tears of relief streaming down her face as she felt Lysa's forehead and found it cool to the touch. Thank you, she whispered, then louder. Thank you. I don't know how to repay such a gift. Your sister lives, Arion interrupted, rising to his feet with less steadiness than before. But my awakening without proper ritual has left me unstable. My power flickers like a candle in the wind, sometimes raging beyond control, sometimes barely present at all. The forest itself suffers from my weakness. Can you not sense it? Mira looked around the temple with new awareness and realized he was right. While the immediate area around them bloomed with renewed life, she could hear sounds of distress from the deeper forest, the groaning of trees under some invisible weight, the distant cries of animals in pain. The very land seemed to be convulsing as Arion's uncontrolled power rippled outward in waves. "What can I do?" she asked, instinctively understanding that this was more than mere gratitude speaking. Some deeper connection had formed between them in that moment when she had first touched the thorn vines, a bond that felt as natural as breathing and as unbreakable as stone. Arion's green eyes met hers, and she saw surprise flicker across his features. "You would help me? Even knowing what I am, what power I wield, your people sealed me away because they feared what I might do in anger or madness. You saved my sister," Mira said simply. "And besides, I can feel that you're not evil. Hurt, yes. Angry, certainly, but not evil." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What did they do to you, the mortals who bound you here?" For a moment, Arion's perfect features twisted with pain and rage so intense, but the very air around them seemed to writhe. Plants withered and died in a circle around his feet, then burst back to life in an explosion of growth that left Mira dizzy. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of betrayal. "I loved them," he said simply. "For eons beyond count, I nurtured their crops and healed their sick, guided the seasons and ensured that life flourished in all its forms. I walked among them as friend and protector, taking mortal shape to better understand their needs and fears. Some I even loved as mortals love, giving my heart freely to those who seemed to return the feeling." His hands clenched into fists, and the temperature in the temple dropped perceptibly. "But mortals are creatures of change and growth, and their understanding grew along with their ambitions. They began to see my power not as a gift freely given, but as something that might be controlled and directed to serve their desires. They wanted me to favor their enemies with drought and famine, to grant them dominion over other lands and peoples." Mira felt her heart break a little at the anguish in his voice. "And when you refused?" "What I refused, they named me dangerous and unpredictable. They said that no being should hold such power over life and death, that the very existence of gods was a threat to mortal freedom." Arion's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "So they gathered their greatest mages and priests, the very ones I had empowered with knowledge of the natural world. And they crafted bindings of thorn and shadow. They told me it was for the good of all, but I would sleep until I learned to be tame." The word dripped with such contempt that several of the temple columns cracked audibly. Mira reached out instinctively and placed her hand on Arion's arm, feeling the tension in his powerful frame. At her touch, the wild fluctuations of his power steadied slightly, as if her presence served as some kind of anchor. "How long?" she asked softly. 700 years, near as I can reckon. 7 centuries of dreaming dark dreams while the forest suffered from my absence and the natural order grew wild and chaotic without guidance." Arion looked down at her hand on his arm with an expression of wonder. "You are the first mortal to touch me without fear or calculation since my binding. The first to see me as something other than a force to be harnessed or a threat to be contained." The connection between them pulsed stronger at his words, and Mira found herself drawn into his green eyes as if they were pools of forest light. There was something happening here that went beyond gratitude or simple attraction, a recognition that ran soul deep, as if they had been searching for each other across the years without knowing it. "Stay with me," Arion said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did Mira. "Help me regain control of my power before it tears the forest apart. In return, I will ensure that no sickness or harm ever touches your sister again." Mira glanced at Lysa, who slept peacefully among the flowering vines, her breathing deep and steady. The fever was truly broken, and already she looked more like her old self than she had in days. But return to the village meant explanations that no one would believe, suspicion and fear from those who had forbidden the forest in the first place. "For how long?" she asked. "I do not know," Arion admitted. "My power has been bound and twisted for so long that I barely remember how it felt to wield it with precision. It could take days, weeks, even months to fully restore the balance." He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "And I find myself reluctant to lose the first companionship I have known in centuries." The honesty in his voice decided her. "Then I'll stay. But Lysa will need care, and she'll be frightened when she wakes in a strange place." "The temple will provide for her needs," Arion said with quiet confidence, "and I believe she will find the forest less frightening than most mortals do. Children often see more clearly than their elders, with less fear to cloud their vision." As if summoned by his words, Lysa stirred on the temple steps and opened her eyes. Instead of the fear Mira had expected, her sister's face lit up with wonder as she took in their surroundings. The flowering vines, the restored marble columns gleaming in the dappled sunlight. The sense of ancient magic that filled the air like music hall of it seemed to delight rather than terrify her. "Mira?" Lysa's voice was stronger than it had been in days, clear and sweet without the rasp of fever. "Where are we?" "This place is beautiful." "Somewhere safe," Mira said, helping her sister sit up. "How do you feel?" "Better. Much better." Lysa stretched like a cat in sunshine, then noticed Arion standing nearby. Instead of shrinking back in fear, she studied him with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you the one who made me well?" "I am," Arion replied, and his voice was gentler when addressing the child. "Your sister traveled far and risked much to bring you here." Lysa turned to Mira with eyes wide with understanding. "You came to the Forbidden Forest. For me." It wasn't a question somehow. She grasped the magnitude of what Mira had done without needing explanation. "I would go anywhere for you," Mira said simply, smoothing her sister's hair. "Even to the ends of the world, if that's Kakawur, what it took." Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself within the ancient temple. Arion worked to regain control over his chaotic power, practicing exercises of will and focus that sometimes sent shockwaves of energy rippling through the forest. Mira helped where she could, serving as a stabilizing presence that seemed to calm the worst of his fluctuations. And Lysa explored their magical surroundings with the fearless enthusiasm of youth, befriending the forest creatures that came to investigate the gods' awakening. The temple itself seemed to respond to their presence, rooms and chambers that had been choked with vines revealing themselves as the vegetation receded. A natural spring provided fresh water, while fruit trees heavy with impossible abundance offered sustenance. Soft mosses formed comfortable sleeping areas, and flowering vines created privacy screens with an intelligence that suggested they responded to the inhabitants' needs. But it was the growing connection between Mira and Arion that proved most remarkable. What had begun as simple gratitude and mutual respect deepened into something neither had expected. She found herself fascinated by his stories of the ancient world. The way he described the intricate relationships between all living things with the passion of a poet and the precision of a scholar. He, in turn, seemed amazed by her practical wisdom and the strength of spirit that had driven her to risk everything for love of her sister. "You do not fear me," Arion observed one evening as they sat together on the temple steps, watching Lysa chase fireflies through the gathering dusk. "Even when my power runs wild and makes the very stones tremble, you remain calm." "Should I fear you?" Mira asked, genuinely curious. "You've shown us nothing but kindness." "I am not always kind," Arion said quietly. 7 centuries of imprisonment have left scars upon my spirit that may never fully heal. There are times when the rage rises like a tide, and I want nothing more than to see the cities of mortals crumble into dust. The power I wield could lay waste to entire kingdoms if I chose to unleash it." Mira considered this, watching the way the fireflies seemed to dance more brightly in Arion's presence, as if drawn to the life force that radiated from him. "But you don't choose that," she said finally. "Even in your anger, even with all that power at your command, you choose restraint. That's not weakness, it's the greatest strength I can imagine." Arion turned to look at her, something shifting in his expression. "How can you see good in me when my own people decided I was too dangerous to remain free?" "Because I'm not them," Mira replied simply. "I don't see you as a force to be controlled or a threat to be contained. I see someone who was betrayed by those he loved, who has every reason to hate mortals and yet still chooses to heal rather than harm." She paused, gathering courage for her next words. "I see someone I could love, if he would let me." The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Arion's breathing had quickened, and the air around them shimmered with barely controlled power. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Love between mortal and God is a dangerous thing. I am eternal, or near enough. You will age and die while I remain unchanged. And my very nature means that my emotions have power to reshape the world around us. If I love you and lose you to time or chance, the grief might drive me to madness." "And if you don't love me," Mira said softly, "you'll never know what we might have had together. Isn't that its own kind of madness?" Before he could answer, Lysa came running back to them, her hands cupped carefully around something that glowed with soft silver light. "Look what I found," she said excitedly. "It was growing near the spring, but when I touched it, it started to shine." She opened her hands to reveal a flower unlike any Mira had ever seen, petals of crystalline silver that seemed to hold captured moonlight, with a center that pulsed like a tiny star. Arion's sharp intake of breath told her this was no ordinary forest bloom. "A heart's truth flower," he said wonderingly. "I thought they were extinct, lost when the old magic faded from the world. They only bloom in places where true love has taken root, and their light burns brighter the stronger that love becomes." As if to demonstrate his words, the flower's glow intensified until it rivaled the fireflies dancing around them. Lysa giggled in delight, but Mira found herself staring at Arion with dawning understanding. The flower had bloomed at her sister's touch, but it responded to the love that surrounded it, the love between the sisters, yes, but also the growing connection between Mira and the god who had saved them both. "It's beautiful," Mira breathed, reaching out to touch one of the silver petals. The moment her skin made contact with the flower, warmth spread through her entire being, and she felt Arion's presence in her mind like sunlight breaking through clouds. Not an invasion, but an invitation, a doorway opened between their souls that would allow perfect understanding if she chose to step through it. She looked up to find Arion watching her with an expression of such longing and fear that her heart clenched. Here was a being of immense power, who had been betrayed and abandoned, who had every reason to guard his heart against further pain. Yet he was offering her something more precious than all his magic, the chance to truly know him, to see past the god to the being beneath, who yearned for connection as desperately as any mortal ever had. Without hesitation, Mira opened her heart to his presence, feeling his thoughts and emotions flow into her like a river finding the sea. The sensation was overwhelming centuries of memory and experience, pain and joy and wonder beyond mortal comprehension. But beneath it all was the truth she had glimpsed from the beginning. Arion was not the dangerous force his people had believed him to be, but rather a being of profound gentleness, who wielded terrible power with the careful restraint of one who understood its true cost. And he loved her. The emotion blazed through their connection like wildfire, pure and desperate and terrifying in its intensity. Not the shallow attraction of physical desire, but something deeper, recognition of the soul that matched his own, completion of a loneliness so vast he had forgotten it was possible to fill it. Mira. Her name on his lips was a prayer and a promise. "If we do this, if we allow this bond to form, there will be no going back. You will be tied to me as long as you live, able to feel my emotions as I feel yours. And when your mortal life ends..." "Ends what?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "I could bind your soul to mine, make you as eternal as I am, but the transformation would change you in ways I cannot predict, and you would have to leave your mortal life behind forever." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I will not ask such a sacrifice of you." Mira glanced at Lysa, who was examining the heart's truth flower with scientific curiosity, seemingly oblivious to the momentous conversation taking place beside her. Her sister was healthy now, safe and strong, with a whole life ahead of her. She would grow up, find love of her own, perhaps have children who would carry forward the family line. She no longer needed Mira's protection in the same desperate way. "And if I choose mortality?" Mira asked. "If I stay with you for whatever years I have, but accept death when it comes?" Pain flickered across Arion's features. "Then I will love you with everything I am for as long as fate allows. And when you are gone, I will carry the memory of this joy with me into whatever eternity awaits." He cupped her face gently in his hands. "But I fear that losing you might finally break what remains of my sanity. The love I feel for you already burns brighter than anything I have ever known to have it torn away." "Then don't let it be torn away," Mira said, covering his hands with her own. "If the choice is between a mortal lifetime of love and an eternity of regret, how is that even a choice at all? The transformation is irreversible," Arion warned. "You would no longer be human in any meaningful sense. Your connection to moral concerns, even to your sister, would fade as your divine nature awakened. You might come to resent the choice, to hate me for allowing you to betrayal. Make it." Mira considered this soberly, trying to imagine a future where she felt nothing for Lisa, where the bonds of family and humanity fell away like discarded clothing. It was a terrifying prospect, yet when she reached out through their connection, she could feel Arion's absolute certainty that their love would endure and grow beyond anything either of them could currently comprehend. "What does Lisa think?" she asked finally. "She deserves a voice in this decision." They turned to find the 13-year-old watching them with eyes far too knowing for her age. In her hands, the heart's truth flower pulsed with steady silver light, and her expression held a wisdom that spoke of understanding beyond her years. "You love him," Lisa said simply. "Really love him, the way the bards sing about in their stories, and he loves you the same way." She paused, studying Arion's anxious face. "You're afraid of hurting her, aren't you? Of making her into something she'll regret becoming?" "Yes," Arion admitted. "The choice I offer is irreversible, and I have seen too many mortals discover that what they thought they wanted was not what they needed." Lisa nodded as if this made perfect sense. "But Mira always knows what she needs. She knew I needed healing even when the elders said there was no hope. She knew you needed someone to see past the fear and anger to the goodness underneath. And now she knows she needs to be pra. With you, whatever that costs." The girl's smile was radiant with certainty. "Besides, if she becomes immortal, that means I'll never really lose her, doesn't it? She'll always be here in the forest when I need to remember what love looks like." The simple faith in her sister's words brought tears to Mira's eyes. Here was the proof she had needed. Not only did Lisa understand the magnitude of the choice, she supported it with the generous heart that had always made her special. There would be sorrow in their parting, but not the devastating loss Mira had feared. "Then, it's decided," Mira said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was choosing. "If you'll have me, Arion, I choose eternity with you over any mortal lifetime without you." The god's answer was wordless, conveyed through their deepening bond as a flood of joy and relief so intense it made the very air around them sing. The heart's truth flower in Lisa's hands blazed like a captive star, and throughout the forest, plants began to bloom with impossible beauty as Arion's power responded to his emotional state. "The transformation must wait," he said when he could speak again. "My power is still too unstable, too chaotic. If I attempt something so delicate while I cannot control the energies involved, I might destroy you instead of changing you." His expression grew determined. "I will master myself, regain the precision and control I once wielded, and then I will make you mine for all eternity." The days that followed were filled with intensive training as Arion worked to stabilize his chaotic abilities. Mira served as his anchor, her presence providing the emotional stability he needed to focus his will. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to reassert control over the vast forces at his command. The wild fluctuations that had sent shockwaves through the forest grew less frequent and less severe, replaced by the steady, purposeful flow of power under conscious direction. Lisa proved an eager student of the forest's mysteries, learning to identify plants and understand the subtle communications between different species. She seemed to have an intuitive grasp of the natural world that impressed even Arion, who spoke of her potential to become a bridge between the mortal and divine realms. She could be a priestess, he told Mira one afternoon, as they watched Lysa coax a family of foxes out of hiding with patience and gentle words. Not in the old sense of ritual and sacrifice, but as a true servant of the natural order, someone who helps mortals remember their place within the greater web of life. She would like that, Mira agreed. She's always been drawn to growing things, always had a gift for healing hurt animals. She paused, watching her sister's face light up with joy as one of the fox kits allowed her to stroke its fur. Will she age normally? Live a mortal lifespan? Unless she chooses otherwise when she comes of age, Arion replied. The gift of immortality cannot be forced, only offered, but those who serve as bridges between worlds often find their lives extended far beyond normal mortal limits, sustained by the power they channel and the mire, purpose they serve. It was a comforting thought, the idea that Lysa might have choices beyond the simple binary of mortality and divinity. As the weeks passed and Arion's control steadied, Mira found herself thinking less about what she was leaving behind and more about what she was gaining. The connection between them deepened daily, allowing her to share in his perception of the forest as a living entity with its own consciousness and desires. Through his eyes, she began to understand the intricate relationships that govern the natural world, how the death of a single tree could impact creatures miles away, how the health of a stream affected the dreams of deer, how the songs of birds carried messages that shaped the growth of flowers. It was a revelation that left her humbled and awed, a reminder that mortals were only one small part of a vast and complex tapestry of existence. But even as her understanding expanded, Mira never lost sight of her humanity. If anything, her mortal perspective seemed to provide Arion with insights he had forgotten during his long imprisonment. She helped him remember why individual lives mattered, why the love between two people could be as significant as the turning of seasons or the migration of birds. "You anchor me," he told her one evening as they sat together beside the spring that bubbled up from the temple's heart. "Not just in terms of power, but in purpose. For too long, I saw only the grand patterns, the vast cycles of life and death. You remind me that each moment of joy, each act of love, each choice to be kind rather than cruel, these things matter just as much." Mira leaned against his shoulder, marveling at how natural it felt to touch him now, how completely their bond had integrated into her daily existence. "And you've shown me that there's so much more to existence than I've ever imagined. The village felt like the entire world to me before, but now I can sense the pulse of life stretching out in all directions, connecting everything that grows and breathes and dreams." Their quiet moment was interrupted by Lysa's excited voice calling from deeper in the temple. "Mira! Arion! Come quickly, you need to see this." They found the girls standing before a section of wall that had been covered in vines until recently. As Arion's power stabilized, the temple continued to reveal hidden chambers and passages. But this discovery was different. The wall bore an intricate mural depicting scenes from what appeared to be the temple's history, gods and mortals working together in harmony, sharing knowledge and wisdom in ways that benefited both divine and human realms. "Look at this," Lysa said, pointing to a particular section of the artwork. "Is that you, Arion?" The figure she indicated was unmistakably him, though depicted in different garments and with an expression of serene joy rather than the guarded wariness he wore now. Around him stood mortals of various ages, their faces upturned with expressions of trust and love rather than fear or calculation. Children played among flowering vines while adults worked side by side with the god to tend gardens and heal the sick. "That was long ago," Arion said softly, "before suspicion poisoned the relationship between divine and mortal realms. There was a time when we worked as partners rather than rivals, when humanity saw gods not as masters to be obeyed or threats to be contained, but as allies in the great work of nurturing life." "What changed?" Mira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mortals grew in knowledge and power, as was always intended. But with that growth came the belief that they no longer needed divine guidance, that gods were obstacles to their independence rather than resources to draw upon. Arion's expression grew distant with memory. Some of my fellow divinities grew angry at this perceived ingratitude. They demanded worship and sacrifice, sought to compel obedience through displays of terrifying power. That only made matters worse. Lysa traced one of the painted figures with her finger, a child not much younger than herself who sat in the crook of a flowering tree. But you didn't do that. You tried to maintain the partnership. For as long as I could, Arion confirmed. I believed that understanding could bridge the growing gap, that love and patience would eventually overcome fear. I was naive. His voice hardened slightly. When they came to bind me, some of those who participated were mortals I had counted as friends, people whose children I had delivered, and whose crops I had blessed. They spoke of necessity and the greater good while they wrapped me in thorns and cast me into endless sleep. Mira felt his pain through their bond, the deep wound of betrayal that had never properly healed. But she also sensed something else, a growing hope that perhaps the cycle of mistrust and fear might finally be broken. Her presence, her willingness to see past his power to the being beneath, had begun to restore his faith in the possibility of connection between divine and mortal hearts. The old ways are gone, she said carefully, but that doesn't mean new ways can't be found. Look at what's happened. Haruve healed Lysa, shared your knowledge with us, shown us wonders we never could have imagined. And we haven't tried to bind you or control you. We simply loved you for who you are. 3 people, Arion pointed out, though his tone lacked conviction, hardly a representative sample of mortal nature. Every change starts with one person, Lysa said with the certainty of youth. Then it spreads to their family, their friends, their community. Maybe the old partnership between gods and mortals can't be restored exactly as it was, but something new might grow in its place. The mural seemed to shimmer in the torchlight, and for a moment, Mira could almost see the painted figures moving, living out their depicted lives of cooperation and mutual respect. It was a beautiful vision, but one that seemed impossibly distant from the current reality of a world where gods were myths and magic was relegated to children's stories. Yet even as doubt crept into her thoughts, Mira felt Arion's power pulse with renewed purpose. The idea that had taken root that their love might be the beginning of something larger than themselves seemed to be growing stronger by the moment. Perhaps individual hearts could change the world, one connection at a time. The transformation came 3 weeks later, under the light of a full moon that painted the temple silver and made the heart's truth flowers glow like captured stars. Arion had spent days preparing, meditating to achieve perfect control over the vast energies he would need to channel. The slightest error could kill Mira, or worse, turn her into something twisted and unrecognizable. Neither mortal nor divine, but some tormented hybrid caught between states of being. Lysa stood witness as Mira lay upon the altar where Arion himself had once been bound. Though now it was wreathed in flowers rather than thorns. The stone beneath her was warm, pulsing with contained power, and the air itself seemed to throng with anticipation. Every creature in the forest had fallen silent, as if the very world held its breath for what was to come. "Are you certain?" Arion asked one final time, his hands hovering over her heart. "Once I begin, there will be no stopping, no changing your mind. You will cease to be human in any meaningful sense." "I'm certain," Mira replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He smiled then, the expression transforming his perfect features into something radiant with joy and love. "Then let us begin your rebirth, my heart. Let us make you eternal." The power that flowed from his hands into her body was like liquid light, warm and tingling as it spread through her veins. At first, the sensation was almost pleasant, a gentle awakening of senses she hadn't known she possessed. But as the divine energy penetrated deeper, reaching into the very essence of what made her human, the process became more intense. Mira felt her mortality burning away like dross in a forge, replaced by something vast and shining that stretched her consciousness beyond anything she had ever imagined. She could suddenly perceive the life force of every creature in the forest, feel the slow pulse of trees and the quick flutter of insect hearts, sensed the underground networks of roots and fungal threads that connected the entire ecosystem in a web of communication and mutual support. Her body began to change as well, growing taller and more graceful, her ordinary brown hair taking on auburn highlights that seemed to glow with inner fire. Her eyes shifted from their original hazel to a deep gold that held flecks of green. And her skin acquired the same subtle luminescence that marked Arion as something more than mortal. But it was the expansion of her consciousness that proved most overwhelming. Suddenly she could feel the dreams of hibernating, bears, the slow thoughts of ancient oaks, the quick bright joy of rabbits discovering new meadows. The sheer volume of sensation threatened to drown her individual identity in a flood of connection to all living things. Just as panic began to set in, she felt Arion's presence in her mind, strong and steady and utterly devoted. His love became her anchor, allowing her to maintain her sense of self even as her awareness expanded to encompass the entire forest. Through their bond, she learned to filter the constant stream of life sensation, to remain Mira even while becoming something far more than she had been. When the transformation finally completed, Mira sat up slowly, marveling at the way her enhanced senses painted the world in new colors and textures. She could see the flow of magic through the temple stones, feel the contentment of night-blooming flowers as they opened to the moonlight, hear the whispered conversations of nocturnal creatures welcoming the return of their god's full power. "How do you feel?" Arion asked, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. The transformation had cost him greatly, requiring him to pour much of his restored energy into the delicate work of remaking her essential nature. "Different," Mira said honestly, flexing fingers that now ended in nails like polished amber. "Bigger, somehow. As if I'd been living in a small room my entire life, and suddenly discovered there's a vast mansion beyond the door." She paused, testing the strange new awareness that connected her to everything around them. "But still myself. Still the woman who loves you and would do anything to protect my sister." Lysa approached cautiously, her eyes wide with wonder at the change in her sister's appearance. "You're beautiful," she whispered, "like something out of a fairy tale." Mira held out her arms, and Lysa flew into them without hesitation. The embrace felt different. Mira could sense her sister's life force directly, feel the steady beat of her heart and the bright warmth of her spirit. But the love between them remained unchanged, as strong and pure as ever. "I'm still your sister," Mira said softly. "That will never change, no matter what else I become." "I know," Lysa replied, pulling back to study Mira's transformed features. "You feel the same inside, just more. Like you were always meant to be this way and only now remembered how." It was an astute observation that made Arion smile with pride. "Your sister has the gift of seeing truth beneath surface appearances. She will make an excellent bridge between worlds when she comes of age." Over the following months, Mira learned to master her new abilities under Arion's patient guidance. She discovered she could accelerate plant growth with a touch, heal minor injuries with her breath, and communicate with animals through a form of empathic projection. More importantly, she learned to balance her expanded awareness with her individual consciousness, to be part of the greater web of life without losing herself in its vastness. The forest itself seemed to celebrate her transformation, blooming with unprecedented beauty and abundance. Creatures that had fled during the chaotic period of Arion's awakening returned in greater numbers than before, creating a paradise of biodiversity that rivaled the legendary gardens of the ancient world. The temple, too, continued to reveal its secrets, hidden chambers and passages opening to welcome its new divine inhabitants. But perhaps the most significant change was in Arion himself. The rage and bitterness that had shadowed him since his awakening began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and hope, with Mira as his partner and equal. He no longer felt like a relic of a bygone age, but rather like the founder of something entirely new, a different kind of relationship between divine and mortal realms. One based on love and mutual respect rather than fear or domination. They were not alone in their new beginning. Lysa's presence served as a constant reminder of the best qualities humanity had to offer, while her growing ability suggested that she might indeed become the bridge Arion had envisioned. Other mortals began to appear as well, drawn by stories of healing and wonder that spread despite the village elders' attempts to suppress them. These visitors came seeking various things. Some wanted healing for themselves or loved ones. Others hoped to witness magic they had only heard about in stories, and a few simply felt called by something they couldn't name. Mira and Arion welcomed them all, offering what help they could while carefully observing how each person reacted to the presence of divine power. Most left grateful and awed, carrying tales that would spread the story of the healing god and his beloved even further. Few, however, reacted with the familiar fear and suspicion that had led to Arion's original imprisonment. These visitors were not turned away in anger, but neither were they encouraged to return. The new age that was dawning would not be built through force or coercion, but through the gradual changing of hearts and minds. One evening, as autumn painted the forest in shades of crack, gold and crimson, Mira found herself standing at the edge of the temple grounds, gazing toward the distant village where she had once lived. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had carried Lysa through the darkness, desperate and determined to find healing regardless of the cost. Now, transformed and eternal, she barely resembled the frightened young woman who had defied the elders' warnings to enter the forbidden forest. "Do you regret it?" Arion asked, materializing beside her with the silent grace that still took her breath away. "Leaving your old life behind for this uncertain future?" Mira considered the question seriously, testing her emotions for any hidden reservations or doubts. What she found was a peace so complete it seemed to radiate from her very bones. A certainty that she had made the right choice regardless of what challenges lay ahead. "Never," she said firmly. "How could I regret finding my other half, my perfect match? How could I regret becoming part of something larger and more beautiful than I ever dreamed possible?" She turned to face him, her golden eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "The only thing I regret is that it took so long for our paths to cross." Arion's smile was radiant with joy and love, so pure it made the very air around them shimmer. "Then let us make the most of the eternity before us, beloved. Let us build something worthy of the love that brought us together." As if summoned by his words, Lysa appeared through the trees, her arms full of the evening's harvest from the temple gardens. At 15 now, she had grown tall and graceful, her affinity for the natural world stronger with each passing season. Behind her came a small group of pilgrims who had arrived that afternoon, a family seeking healing for their youngest child, a scholar hoping to record the true history of the old gods, and a young woman who claimed to have dreamed of the forest calling her name. "Dinner's ready," Lysa announced cheerfully, "and our guests had the most fascinating stories to share." The scholar thinks he might have found references to other temples like this one, hidden in ancient texts that most people assume are pure mythology. Mira and Arion exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. If other temples existed, if other gods might still slumber in forgotten groves and hidden valleys, then perhaps their small beginning was part of something even larger than they had imagined. Perhaps the age of cooperation between divine and mortal was not truly ended, but only dormant, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken it once more. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the temple where their guests waited, their love a beacon that would guide others through the darkness of fear and misunderstanding toward a brighter future. The forest sang around them, every leaf and flower and creature adding its voice to a harmony that spoke of hope, renewal, and the endless possibility that came from hearts brave enough to choose love over fear. The years that followed brought changes both subtle and profound to the forest and the wider world beyond. Word of the healing god and his beloved spread like ripples on a pond, carried by grateful pilgrims to distant lands where it took root in the most unexpected places. Some dismissed the tales as mere folklore, but others found themselves drawn by a longing they couldn't quite name, a hunger for magic, and wonder in a world that had grown increasingly gray and practical. The temple became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking more than just physical healing. Scholars came to study the ancient murals and learn about the true history of divine-mortal relations. Artists arrived hoping to capture the impossible beauty of flowers that bloomed with inner light. Young people with gifts they didn't understand sought guidance in learning to use abilities that mainstream society would dismiss as imagination or madness. Mira discovered that her transformation had granted her more than just extended life and enhanced senses. She had become something like a conduit between the divine and mortal realms, able to help others access their own latent magical abilities or spiritual insights. Under her guidance, a new generation of bridge builders began to emerge, mortals who retained their humanity while developing deeper connections to the natural world and its hidden powers. Lysa proved to be the most gifted of these students, her natural empathy and love of growing things evolving into abilities that rivaled those of the minor nature spirits. She could speak with animals as easily as humans, encourage plants to grow in ways that defied conventional agriculture, and sense disturbances in the natural order from miles away. But more importantly, she served as living proof that the old fears about gods and magic were unfounded, that power could be wielded with wisdom and restraint, that divinity did not necessarily corrupt those who touched it. As Lysa grew into womanhood, she began to venture beyond the forest boundaries, carrying the temple's message of healing and harmony to communities that had never heard such ideas. She established small gardens in villages and towns, teaching people to work with rather than against the natural forces that shaped their world. These gardens became gathering places for those interested in the old ways, nuclei around which new communities of practitioners slowly formed. The resistance to these changes was significant, but not overwhelming. The old fears ran deep, reinforced by generations of stories about capricious gods and dangerous magic. Some religious leaders denounced the forest temple as heretical, while certain scholars insisted that claims of divine intervention were simply misunderstood natural phenomena. A few kingdoms even attempted to organize expeditions to capture or destroy the dangerous entities that were supposedly corrupting their citizens with false promises. None of these expeditions ever reached the temple. The forest itself seemed to discourage hostile intrusion, leading would-be attackers in circles until they emerged confused and dispirited at the very edge from which they had entered. Those who came with genuine curiosity or need, however, found the paths clear and welcoming, as if the trees themselves could sense the difference between friend and foe. Arion's power continued to grow and stabilize, but it was a controlled growth now, guided by wisdom and tempered by love rather than driven by rage or desperation. He learned to work within the existing order rather than trying to remake it entirely, influencing the natural world in subtle ways that supported rather than disrupted human civilization. Droughts were gently eased, crop diseases were quietly cured, and natural disasters were turned aside with a delicate touch that left no obvious signs of divine intervention. More importantly, he began to remember what it felt like to trust mortals again. Each pilgrim who approached the temple with genuine respect and openness helped heal the wounds left by his ancient betrayal. He saw that the capacity for growth and change that had once made mortals seem threatening could also make them capable of learning from past mistakes, of choosing cooperation over domination when shown a better way. The love between Mira and Arion continued to deepen with each passing year, their bond serving as an anchor point around which their individual growth could safely orbit. They learned to balance their unity with their distinctiveness, to be truly one while remaining truly themselves. Their partnership became a template for others seeking to bridge the gap between different natures or ways of being, proof that love could indeed conquer the seemingly insurmountable differences between divine and mortal hearts. On the 10th anniversary of Mira's transformation, as autumn once again painted the forest in brilliant hues, the temple received an unexpected visitor. Unlike the usual pilgrims who approached openly along the forest paths, this figure materialized directly within the temple grounds, as if stepping through an invisible doorway. The newcomer was clearly divine and tall and ethereally beautiful, with silver hair that seemed to flow like liquid moonlight, and eyes that held the depth of starless skies. "Sister," the being said, addressing Mira with a voice like distant wind chimes. Or perhaps I should say, "Fellow goddess, I am Selene, once called the Moon Maiden by those who remembered the old ways." Arion appeared instantly at Mira's side, his power manifesting as a protective aura that made the very air shimmer with barely contained energy. It had been 8 centuries since he had encountered another divine being, and he was taking no chances with his beloved's safety. "Peace, brother," Selene said, raising her hands to show they were empty. "I come not as enemy but as ally. The awakening of your power has been felt throughout the hidden realms where we who remain have taken refuge. Many of my kind are curious about the mortal woman who captured the heart of the Lifebringer and chose divinity for love rather than ambition." End quote. "You speak as if there are others," Mira said, studying the Moon Maiden's ageless features. "Other gods who escaped the Great Binding?" "Some few," Selene confirmed. "Those who hid themselves away when the persecutions began. Who chose exile over imprisonment or death. We have watched from the shadows as the world forgot our true nature and reduced us to myths and legends. But your actions here, the new partnership you have forged with Mordecaind, suggest that perhaps the time of hiding is drawing to an end." The implications of her words were staggering. If other gods still lived, if they could be convinced to emerge from whatever refuges they had found, then the small beginning Mira and Arion had made might indeed grow into something that could reshape the world. But it could also mean complications they had not anticipated, divine politics and ancient grudges that might threaten the fragile peace they had built. "What do you want from us?" Arion asked, his tone carefully neutral. He had learned to be cautious with his fellow divinities, knowing that their agendas could be as complex and hidden as their powers. "To observe," Selene replied simply. "To learn whether this new way you have found is truly sustainable, or merely a beautiful dream destined to shatter when faced with larger realities." She paused, her starry gaze shifting between them. "And perhaps, if your experiment proves successful, to join you in rebuilding what was lost so long ago." Lysa chose that moment to return from her latest mission to the outside world, her arrival announced by the excited chittering of squirrels and the songs of birds that always seemed to herald her presence. Now 25 and fully grown into her powers, she had become something like a high priestess of the new movement, respected and beloved by the growing network of communities that looked to the Forest Temple for guidance. "We have news," she announced as she entered the temple grounds, then stopped short at the sight of their unexpected visitor. "Oh, I didn't realize we had company." "Lisa," Mira said, "I'd like you to meet Selene, an old friend of Arion's." The lie came easily, designed to avoid lengthy explanations while Selene's true intentions remained unclear. But Lysa had inherited more than just magical abilities from her years in the forest. She had also developed an uncanny ability to read the truth behind surface appearances. Her eyes widened as she took in Selene's otherworldly beauty and the aura of ancient power that surrounded her. "You're one of them," she breathed. "One of the other gods. I can feel Iter like Arion, but different. Connected to night and dreams and the silver paths between sleeping and waking." Selene's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Perceptive. Most mortals cannot sense divine nature so clearly, even those with significant magical training." She studied Lysa with new interest. "Tell me, child, what news did you bring that seems so urgent?" Lysa glanced at Mira and Arion, seeking permission to share information with this stranger. At their encouraging nods, she launched into her report. "The network is growing faster than we anticipated," she began. "I've just returned from the Eastern Kingdoms, where 3 more cities have established sacred gardens and begun teaching the partnership principles. But there's been pushback as Wealth of Meridian Empire has declared our teachings heretical and begun persecuting anyone found practicing the old arts. More troubling," she continued, "there are reports of false prophets claiming to speak for you, Arion. Some are harmless seekers who've misunderstood the teachings, but others seem to be deliberately spreading corrupted versions of your message. One group in the northern reaches is demanding tribute and sacrifice, claiming that gods require blood offerings to bestow their blessings." Arion's expression darkened at this news. "This is how it began before," he said grimly. "Twisted teachings and false representations that turned people against the very idea of divine mortal cooperation." He turned to Selene. "You see the challenges we face. Every success brings new complications, new opportunities for misunderstanding and abuse." "Indeed," Selene mused, "but also new opportunities for course correction and guidance. Tell me, have you considered that perhaps you need not face these challenges alone?" At their questioning looks, she elaborated. "If other divinities were to emerge from hiding and add their voices to yours, it might be harder for false prophets to claim exclusive authority. A council of gods working together would be far more difficult to impersonate or corrupt than a single deity working in isolation. Mira felt a stirring of excitement at the suggestion, even as caution warned her to be careful. How many others are there? And what assurance do we have that they would support our approach rather than trying to return to the old ways of dominance and submission? As to the first question, perhaps a dozen who have maintained their full power and awareness through the centuries of exile. Several others exist in reduced states, sleeping or dispersed, who might be awakened and restored with sufficient effort. Celine paused, considering the second question carefully. As to the second, that is why I am here. To observe and evaluate whether this new path you have chosen offers genuine hope for lasting peace, or merely postpones the inevitable return to conflict. Over the following weeks, Celine remained at the temple as an observer, watching the daily operations and interactions that had become the foundation of the new movement. She witnessed the healing ceremonies, the teaching sessions, the careful negotiations with outside authorities who were beginning to take an interest in the forest's activities. She observed how Mira and Arion worked together as partners rather than ruler and subject, how Lysa served as a bridge between divine and mortal perspectives, how the growing community of practitioners maintained their humanity even as they developed supernatural abilities. Most importantly, she watched how visitors were treated not as supplicants to be commanded or resources to be exploited, but as individuals with their own worth and agency. She saw how requests for healing were granted freely regardless of the petitioner's ability to offer payment, how knowledge was shared openly rather than hoarded as a source cracker. Of power, how even those who came with hostile intentions were treated with patience and compassion until they chose to leave of their own accord. It is different, she admitted to Arion during one of their evening conversations. In the old days, even the most benevolent among us saw mortals as children to be guided, or pets to be pampered. We might love them, but we did not respect them as equals. You and Mira have found something else entirely, a partnership based on mutual recognition of worth and agency. It helps that Mira was mortal herself, Arion replied. She understands their perspectives in ways I am still learning. And because she chose transformation rather than having it forced upon her, she bridges the gap between what we are and what we were. The question, Celine said thoughtfully, is whether this model can scale beyond a single temple and its immediate network. Personal relationships are one thing, but governing structures and social institutions are quite another. When you begin dealing with kingdoms and empires rather than individuals and small communities, will these principles hold? It was a sobering question, one that went to the heart of their long-term hopes for changing the world. Mira had been wondering the same thing herself as reports came in of governments beginning to take official notice of their activities. Some kingdoms were sending diplomatic envoys to establish formal relations, while others were mobilizing military forces to contain what they saw as a growing threat to the established order. The test of their principles came sooner than expected. A month after Salim's arrival, a formal embassy arrived from the Meridian Empire, the same nation that had been persecuting practitioners of the forest teachings. The delegation was led by High Inquisitor Valen, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency in rooting out heresy was matched only by his supposed incorruptibility. Unlike the pilgrims and seekers who usually found their way to the temple, this group made no attempt to hide their hostile intentions. They came armed and armored, bearing the authority of an empire that had declared the forest teachings incompatible with public order and divine law. Their very presence was a challenge, a test of whether the gods would respond to official opposition with the terrible wrath that legends attributed to them. Mira and Arion met the embassy at the forest's edge, choosing to face the challenge openly rather than relying on the protective confusion that usually turned away hostile visitors. They appeared in their full divine glory, Arion wreathed in golden light that made plants bloom. At his feet, Mira glowing with silver radiance that seemed to hold the essence of growing things. The display was deliberately impressive, designed to leave no doubt about their true nature. High Inquisitor Valen proved to be a man of middle years, with iron-gray teen, hair and the kind of rigid bearing that spoke of unshakable conviction. He showed no visible fear at their divine manifestation, though several of his subordinates shifted nervously at the raw power on display. "I come bearing a formal ultimatum from His Imperial Majesty," Valid announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Cease your corruption of imperial citizens and withdraw your influence from our territories, or face the consequences of continued interference in mortal affairs." "And what consequences would those be?" Arion asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the insult implicit in the Inquisitor's words. "Economic sanctions against any nation that harbors your followers. Military action against settlements that refuse to renounce your teachings. And if necessary, a holy crusade to purge your influence from the world once and for all." Valen's expression remained impassive as he delivered these threats. His Imperial Majesty is prepared to sacrifice whatever is necessary to protect his people from divine tyranny. The irony of the statement using tyrannical methods to fight supposed tyranny was not lost on Mira, but she held her tongue. This was exactly the kind of challenge Celine had warned them about. The moment when high principles would collide with harsh realities, how they responded would determine whether their movement could truly offer an alternative to the old cycles of dominance and submission. "We appreciate your Emperor's concerns," Mira said carefully, "but I'm afraid he's been misinformed about our activities. We don't corrupt anyone. We offer healing and knowledge to those who seek it freely. We don't demand worship or tribute, and we certainly don't try to overthrow existing governments." "Yet your teachings undermine the authority of established institutions," Valen countered. "When people believe they can access divine power directly, without the mediation of proper religious hierarchies, the result is chaos and rebellion. When they think gods walk among them as friends rather than rulers, they lose respect for legitimate authority." There it was the heart of the opposition they faced. Their crime was not cruelty or oppression, but the simple act of offering people a direct relationship with the divine that bypassed traditional power structures. They threatened not through what they demanded, but through what they freely gave. "People have always had access to divine power," Arion said gently. "We simply help them remember how to use it responsibly. As for respect for authority, we teach that true authority comes from service and wisdom, not from force or fear. Perhaps your Emperor might consider whether his methods inspired genuine loyalty or merely compliance born of terror." Valen's face flushed with anger at the implied criticism. "You dare question the wisdom of one appointed by heaven to rule? You forget your place, godling. The age of divine interference in mortal affairs ended for good reason. Mortals have learned to govern themselves without supernatural guidance." "Have they?" Mira asked, genuinely curious. "I see wars that have raged for generations over resources that could be shared. I see children dying of diseases that could be easily healed. I see brilliant minds wasted because they were born to the wrong class or nation. If this is mortal wisdom in action, perhaps it could benefit from a different perspective." The debate continued for hours, neither side yielding ground but neither resorting to threats or violence. Valen proved to be more than just a rigid enforcer. He was a true believer in the principles he espoused, convinced that divine involvement in mortal affairs inevitably led to suffering and oppression. His arguments were not without merit, rooted in historical examples of gods who had indeed abused their power and mortals who had suffered for it. In the end, no resolution was reached. Valen returned to his empire with the message that the forest gods had refused his emperor's ultimatum but had also shown no signs of aggressive intent. His report would influence whatever response the Meridian Empire chose to make, but for now, an uneasy peace prevailed. "That went better than I expected," Celine observed once the embassy had departed. "In the old days, such an insult would have been answered with earthquake and pestilence, yet you chose dialogue over destruction, even when provoked. What would destruction have accomplished?" Arion asked. "It would only have confirmed their fears and justified whatever retaliation they planned. Better to show them that their assumptions about divine nature are wrong, even if they refuse to believe it immediately." "Spoken like someone who has learned wisdom through suffering," Celine said approvingly. "Very well. I have seen enough to make my decision. With your permission, I would like to contact the others, to see if they might be willing to consider ending their exile." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. If Selene could convince other gods to emerge from hiding and join their cause, it would lend enormous credibility to their efforts. But it would also complicate the careful balance they had achieved, introducing new personalities and agendas into a situation that was already delicate. "What kind of gods are we talking about?" Mira asked. "I mean, what are their domains and temperaments? If we're going to work together, we need to know whether they'll support our approach or try to impose their own methods." Selene settled herself more comfortably on the moss-covered stone where they had been sitting, her expression thoughtful. "Let me tell you about them. There is Theron, god of knowledge and memory, who has spent these centuries maintaining the great libraries hidden beneath the earth. He is scholarly and cautious, more interested in preserving wisdom than in wielding power. Then there is Nerida, goddess of the flowing waters, who has dwelt in the deepest ocean trenches, tending to the creatures of the deep. She is gentle but can be fierce when protecting those under her care." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Corvin, god of the forge and honest labor, has hidden among mortal craftsmen for centuries, teaching innovation while concealing his divine nature. He values practical results over grand gestures. Vera, goddess of truth and justice, has been living as a wandering judge, settling disputes in remote villages where her divine insight is needed most. She has perhaps the strongest feelings about the original betrayal, but also the greatest appreciation for mortal growth, and Dandi's potential. There are others," Selene continued, "each with their own perspective on what went wrong and how it might be set right. Some, like myself, have maintained their full power through careful isolation. Others have diminished themselves deliberately, becoming more like spirits than gods to avoid detection. A few have bound their consciousness to specific locations or objects, waiting for the right moment to emerge." Mira absorbed this information, trying to imagine how such diverse personalities might work together. "And you think they would all be willing to follow our model, rather than trying to return to the old ways?" "That remains to be seen," Selene admitted. "Much will depend on how convincing our evidence proves to be. If they can see that mortals have truly evolved beyond their former limitations, that cooperation is possible without the cycle of worship and exploitation that characterized the ancient world, then yes, I believe most of them would be willing to try." The weeks that followed brought both hope and trepidation as Selene reached out through the hidden networks that connected the surviving gods. Her communications were subtle, and cautious divine beings who had successfully hidden for centuries were not easily found or convinced to reveal themselves. But gradually, responses began to come back, carried by moonbeams and reflected in still water, whispered by night winds and written in the flight patterns of migrating birds. The first to arrive was Theron, materializing in the temple library during the quiet hours before dawn. He appeared as a tall, lean man with silver-streaked dark hair, and eyes that held the weight of millennia of accumulated knowledge. His manner was scholarly and reserved, but Mira sensed a deep curiosity beneath his careful composure. "Show me," he said without preamble, "what you have learned of mortal nature in these years of exile. Convince me that they have truly grown beyond the fear and suspicion that drove them to bind us." Instead of offering arguments, Mira led him to observe the daily activities of the temple and its growing community. She showed him the scholars who came seeking not divine commands but collaborative research, the healers who learned to blend supernatural abilities with medical knowledge, the farmers who worked with rather than against natural forces to increase their yields. Most importantly, she showed him how knowledge was shared freely rather than hoarded, how questions were encouraged rather than punished, how even children were taught to think critically rather than simply accept whatever they were told. Theron's evaluation was thorough and methodical, taking several days as he interviewed visitors and students, examined the temple's growing collection of texts, and tested the intellectual honesty of those who claimed to follow the new teachings. When he finally rendered his verdict, it was with the careful precision of a scholar who had weighed all available evidence. "There has indeed been growth," he acknowledged. "Not universal, and not without setbacks, but genuine development in mortal capacity for wisdom and restraint. These people question authority, including yours, rather than accepting it blindly. They seek understanding rather than mere comfort. They show capacity for the kind of partnership that was impossible in the ancient world. He paused, allowing himself a small smile. I am willing to contribute to this experiment. Nerida's arrival was heralded by an unseasonable rainstorm that left every surface gleaming with moisture and filled the air with the scent of deep ocean currents. She manifested near the temple's sacred spring, her form shifting between human appearance and something more fluid and elemental. Where Theron was reserved and analytical, Nerida was warmth and intuitive understanding, her empathy so powerful that even the shyest forest creatures emerged to greet her. The waters have spoken of what you do here, she said, her voice carrying the sound of waves on distant shores. They carry word of healing that flows freely, of power shared rather than hoarded. The sea creatures tell me that the balance shifts toward something new and hopeful. Her oceanic gaze studied Mira and Arion with ancient wisdom. But waters can be deceived by surface ripples. Show me the depths of what you have built. For Nerida, the proof came not through observation but through immersion. She joined the daily rhythms of temple life, helping with healing ceremonies, sharing her vast knowledge of aquatic ecosystems, and offering her perspective on the interconnectedness of all living systems. Her presence brought a new dimension to their work and understanding of cycles and flows that complemented Arion's focus on growth and renewal. I have spent centuries in the depths, she told them after a week of such participation, nursing the wounds that mortal pollution has inflicted on the ocean realms. I had begun to believe that your species was incapable of seeing beyond its immediate needs, but here I see evidence of a longer view, of genuine care for consequences and connections. Her smile was radiant as sunrise on calm seas. Count me among your allies. Corvin's arrival was announced not by dramatic manifestations, but by the sudden improvement in every piece of metalwork and craftsmanship within the temple grounds. Tools became sharper and more durable. Structures grew more stable and elegant, and even simple pottery took on an artistic quality that spoke of divine inspiration. The god himself appeared as a stocky, powerfully built man with calloused hands, and the kind of practical bearing that spoke of someone who valued results over appearances. I've been watching your work for weeks, he admitted without embarrassment. Old Habitsi like to understand how things are built before I decide whether they're worth joining. His examination had been characteristically thorough, involving not just observation but active testing of the principles they espoused. I sent agents to your outlying communities, posed challenges to your followers, even tried to bribe some of your students to see if they could be corrupted. And what did you find? Arion asked, genuinely curious about this unconventional evaluation. Solid foundation, Corvin replied with satisfaction. Good materials, sound construction methods, attention to detail where it matters. Oh, there are flaws. Some of your people are naive. Others are too trusting, and a few are starting to develop the kind of pride that comes before a fall. But the basic structure is sound, and the craftsmanship improves with each iteration. He paused, his expression growing more serious. The real test will come when you face genuine pressure, when enemies with real power try to tear down what you've built. But for now, you've earned a master craftsman's approval. Vera's arrival was the most dramatic yet, announced by a column of pure white light that descended from the heavens and filled the temple with the resonance of absolute truth. When the radiance faded, it revealed a woman of middle years with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through surface appearances to the reality beneath. Her very presence made lies impossible not through any compulsion, but through an atmosphere of clarity that made deception seem pointless and crude. I have heard the accusations against you, she said, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment. That you seek to corrupt mortals with false promises, that you offer power without responsibility, that you would return the world to the chaos of the ancient days when gods ruled through whim and terror. Her gaze moved between Mira and Arion, searching for any hint of deception or hidden agenda. I have also heard the defenses offered by your supporters. Now, I would hear truth from your own lips. What followed was the most intense examination any of them had yet faced. Vera's questions cut to the heart of their motivations, their methods, and their long-term goals with surgical precision. She probed for inconsistencies, tested their commitment to their stated principles, and challenged them to defend choices that even they sometimes questioned. Under her scrutiny, every rationalization crumbled, every convenient self-deception was stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of what they were trying to accomplish. "We don't have all the answers," Mira admitted under that relentless examination. "We're making this up as we go along, trying to find a path between the mistakes of the past and the uncertainties of the future. Sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes our good intentions have unintended consequences. But we're trying to do better, to be better than what came before." "And what if you fail?" Vera pressed. "What if this experiment in cooperation collapses into the same cycles of dominance and rebellion that destroyed the ancient partnerships? What if your very attempt to avoid the old mistakes creates new and worse ones? Then we'll learn from those failures too," Arion replied steadily. "And we'll keep trying until we get it right, or until there's no one left to try. The alternative, giving up, accepting that gods and mortals can never truly trust each other, is no alternative at all." For long moments, Vera studied them in silence, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, her stern features softened into something approaching approval. "Truth," she said simply. "Incomplete truth, uncertain truth, truth that acknowledges its own limitations, but truth nonetheless. You do not claim perfection or inevitability. You simply claim the right to try, and the wisdom to keep trying even in the face of failure." Her smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "That is more honesty than I have heard from mortals or gods in centuries. You have my support." With 4 new allies added to their cause, the character of the temple community began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Each god brought their own perspective and expertise, creating a council of divine voices that could offer more comprehensive guidance than any single deity working alone. More importantly, their presence provided evidence that the forest temple was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a larger movement toward renewed cooperation between divine and mortal realms. The changes were visible in many ways. Theron established a proper library and research center, attracting scholars from across the known world who came to access knowledge that had been lost for generations. Nerida's influence brought improvements to agriculture and water co-crowd, management that spread from the temple's immediate vicinity to distant farming communities. Corvin's practical wisdom enhanced every aspect of infrastructure and craftsmanship, while Vera's presence ensured that disputes were resolved fairly and that justice remained at the heart of all their endeavors. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the outside world began to perceive their movement. Where once they had been dismissed as a local curiosity or feared as a potential threat, the presence of multiple gods working in harmony forced even their harshest critics to take them seriously. Diplomatic overtures increased, with kingdoms and city-states seeking to establish formal relations with what was increasingly seen as a legitimate power in regional affairs. The Meridian Empire, however, remained hostile, its emperor apparently viewing the growing influence of the forest gods as a direct challenge to his authority. Reports reached the temple of increased persecution in imperial territories, with practitioners of the new teachings being arrested, their gardens destroyed, and their communities scattered. High Inquisitor Valen had returned with additional authority to root out what imperial proclamations now termed the divine conspiracy against rightful mortal rule. "They're afraid," Lisa observed during one of the council meetings where such reports were discussed. "Not of what we've done, but of what we represent. If people see that gods can be partners rather than masters, they start questioning why their human rulers demand absolute obedience." "A valid concern," Vera noted with characteristic directness. "Many moral leaders have built their authority on the assumption that hierarchy is natural and necessary. If people begin to believe that cooperation between equals is possible, it does indeed threaten structures based on dominance and submission." The question of how to respond to imperial hostility without abandoning their principles became a central focus of debate. Some suggested direct intervention, using their combined power to protect their followers and demonstrate the futility of opposing divine will. Others advocated for complete non-resistance, trusting that the righteousness of their cause would eventually triumph without need for force. It was Mira who proposed the solution that eventually carried the day. What if we invited the Emperor himself to come and see what we're actually doing? Not through ambassadors or inquisitors, but in person. Let him observe our daily operations, meet our students and followers, and judge for himself whether we're the threat he believes us to be. The suggestion was met with skepticism from most of the council. Divine beings did not typically request audiences with mortal rulers, as if they were equals seeking negotiation. The very idea seemed to diminish their status and authority, potentially setting a precedent that could undermine their influence elsewhere. Sometimes, Arion said thoughtfully, the strongest position is the one that appears weakest. If we approach the Emperor as partners seeking dialogue rather than as powers demanding submission, we force him to respond in kind or reveal himself as unreasonable. Either outcome serves our purposes. The formal invitation was crafted with careful attention to diplomatic protocol, acknowledging the Emperor's authority within his own domains, while asserting their own legitimacy in matters relating to divine affairs. It offered safe passage, guaranteed his personal security during any visit, and promised full access to their facilities and operations. Most importantly, it framed the invitation not as a summons or demand, but as an opportunity for mutual understanding between representatives of two different but equally valid approaches to governance. The Emperor's response came swiftly and was precisely what they had hoped for. Public refusal that revealed the weakness of his position. In rejecting their offer of dialogue, he appeared to be the unreasonable party, unwilling to examine evidence that might challenge his preconceptions. His proclamation denouncing the invitation as an attempt to legitimize divine interference in mortal affairs only served to highlight the contrast between his rigid authoritarianism and their willingness to engage in good faith negotiation. More importantly, the invitation and its rejection sparked debate throughout the empire and beyond. Citizens who had previously accepted imperial propaganda about the dangerous forest gods began to question why their emperor refused even to investigate the claims being made. Scholars and philosophers debated the implications of divine beings seeking dialogue rather than demanding worship. Religious leaders found themselves forced to articulate why cooperation with benevolent gods should be forbidden, while submission to potentially corrupt human rulers was mandated. The effect was exactly what Mira had predicted. By appearing weak, they had revealed their opponent's actual weakness. The Emperor's authority rested on the assumption that his word was final and unquestionable. By offering him a choice he couldn't accept without undermining his own position, they had exposed the limitations of power based on force rather than consent. Brilliant strategy, Theron acknowledged during their next council meeting. You've turned his own rigidity against him, made his strength into weakness. The more forcefully he rejects dialogue, the more reasonable you appear by comparison. But the immediate tactical victory came with longer-term strategic costs. The Emperor's refusal to engage meant that imperial persecution of their followers would likely intensify rather than diminish. Communities that had begun practicing the new teachings would face increasing pressure to abandon them or risk imprisonment, exile, or worse. The moral victory of appearing reasonable would ring hollow if it came at the cost of their supporters' lives and freedom. It was Corvin who raised the crucial question during their debates about how to respond to escalating persecution. At what point does our commitment to nonviolence become complicity in the suffering of innocents? If we had the power to protect our followers but choose not to use it, are we really upholding our principles or simply avoiding moral responsibility? The question struck at the heart of their philosophical framework. They had built their movement on the premise that power should be used in service rather than domination, that cooperation was superior to coercion in all circumstances. But what happened when faced with opponents who rejected such principles entirely, who used violence and oppression as their primary tools of control? The old ways would be simple, Celine observed quietly. Strike down the Emperor and his inquisitors, demonstrate the futility of opposing divine will, rule through fear as gods have always done. It would be effective in the short term, but it would also prove that our critics were right about divine nature being fundamentally incompatible with mortal freedom. Yet, if we do nothing, Mira countered, we abandon those who trusted us enough to follow our teachings. They suffer for their faith in our message of hope and cooperation, while we remain safe in our forest sanctuary debating philosophy. The debate continued for days, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of justice, the limits of nonviolence, and the responsibilities that came with wielding ultimate power. Each member of the council brought their own perspective to the discussion, but no easy answers emerged. The situation was unprecedented, gods seeking to build lasting peace, rather than impose temporary order. Choosing persuasion over compulsion even when faced with systematic oppression. It was Lysa who eventually proposed the compromise that allowed them to move forward. What if we focus on protection rather than retaliation? Use our power to shield our followers from harm without directly attacking their persecutors. Create sanctuaries where the imperial authorities simply cannot operate, where their power fails without our having to destroy anyone. The idea had merit from both practical and philosophical standpoints. It would provide immediate relief for those suffering under imperial persecution, without requiring them to abandon their commitment to non-violence. It would demonstrate their power while emphasizing its defensive rather than aggressive nature. And it would force the emperor to either escalate his opposition to clearly unreasonable levels, or accept the existence of spaces beyond his control. Implementation began with the establishment of sanctuary zones around existing communities of practitioners, areas where imperial authority simply ceased to function. Guards found themselves unable to enter designated boundaries. Their weapons refused to function properly, and their orders seemed to slip from their minds like water through fingers. The effect was not dramatic or obviously supernatural, but it was absolutely effective in creating spaces where people could practice the new teachings without fear of persecution. The emperor's response was predictably escalatory, unable to reach the practitioners' specter directly. He began targeting their friends and families who lived outside the sanctuary zones. Economic warfare followed, with imperial merchants forbidden to trade with any community that harbored the divine conspiracy. Military pressure mounted as well, with imperial forces massing on the borders of kingdoms that maintained diplomatic relations with the forest gods. "He's trying to force us into a more aggressive response," Mira observed during one of their strategy sessions. "Make the cost of restraint so high that we're compelled to abandon our principles and respond with the kind of divine wrath that would justify his original fears." "Then we don't give him what he wants," Mira replied firmly. "We find ways to support our followers and their communities without playing into his narrative about dangerous gods who threaten mortal autonomy." What emerged was a sophisticated campaign of indirect assistance that operated just below the threshold of open divine intervention. Crops in regions facing imperial economic sanctions suddenly became more abundant and disease-resistant. Trade routes that bypassed imperial territories became safer and more profitable. Natural disasters that might have provided the emperor with opportunities to demonstrate his indispensability were quietly prevented or mitigated. The cumulative effect was to make imperial authority seem increasingly irrelevant to the daily lives of ordinary people. Communities that had been dependent on imperial trade and protection discovered they could prosper without them. Citizens who had feared the consequences of defying imperial will found that the promised retribution never materialized, while those who remained loyal received no particular benefits for their compliance. "You're demonstrating the ultimate truth about power," Theron noted with admiration, "that it depends on the consent of the governed. By showing people they can thrive without imperial protection, you're undermining the entire foundation of the emperor's authority." The strategy proved more effective than anyone had dared hope. Within a year of its implementation, entire provinces were operating effectively outside imperial control, maintained loyalty to the crown in name only while looking to local leaders who followed the forest teachings for actual governance. The emperor found himself ruling an increasingly hollow empire, his commands ignored by subjects who no longer feared the consequences of disobedience. But success brought its own complications. As imperial authority crumbled, other powers moved to fill the vacuum. Neighboring kingdoms began extending their influence into former imperial territories, not always with benevolent intentions. Local strongmen emerged who claimed divine mandate for their own authoritarian rule. Most troubling, some communities began demanding more direct divine intervention in their affairs, seeking to replace imperial oppression with divine dominion. This is how the old partnerships began to corrupt, Celine warned during one particularly difficult council session. When mortals start seeing gods as solutions to all their problems rather than partners in solving them, the next step is always the demand that we take full responsibility for their governance and welfare. The warning proved prescient. Delegations began arriving at the temple requesting divine arbitration of territorial disputes, divine sanction for new rulers, divine intervention in conflicts that had nothing to do with the principles they espoused. Some communities wanted gods to serve as eternal kings, others demanded divine punishment for their enemies, and a few even suggested that divine rule would be more just than any mortal alternative. Each request required careful consideration and diplomatic handling. They needed to provide enough support to maintain their followers' faith, while avoiding the trap of becoming the kind of divine authorities their movement explicitly rejected. The balance was delicate and required constant adjustment as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. "We're walking a tightrope," Mira observed during one of her private conversations with Arion. "Too little involvement and our supporters feel abandoned. Too much and we become the very thing we're trying to replace." "The difficulty is precisely what gives me hope," Arion replied thoughtfully. "In the old days, the path from divine assistance to divine dominion was smooth and inevitable. The fact that we struggle with these choices, that we question every intervention and worry about its implications, suggests that we've truly learned from past mistakes." Their conversation was interrupted by Lysa's arrival, her expression grave with the weight of troubling news. Now in her late 20s and widely recognized as the most effective bridge between divine and mortal realms, she served as their primary contact with the outside world and often brought reports that shaped their strategic decisions. "We have a problem," she announced without preamble. "A big one. High Inquisitor Valen has convinced 3 neighboring kingdoms to form a coalition against us. They're calling it the Alliance for Mortal Sovereignty, and they're preparing for what they term a final solution to the divine question." The news was sobering but not entirely unexpected. The collapse of imperial authority had created regional instability that neighboring powers naturally sought to exploit. If those powers could unite under the banner of opposing divine influence, they might pose a genuine threat to everything the forest gods had built. "What kind of final solution are we talking about?" Corvin asked, his practical mind immediately focusing on the tactical implications. "Complete eradication," Lysa replied grimly. "They've recruited mages who claim to have developed new binding rituals based on the ones used against Arion centuries ago. They're gathering artifacts and weapons supposedly capable of harming divine beings. And they're planning a coordinated assault on all known sanctuaries and communities that follow our teachings." The threat was serious enough to demand immediate attention from the full council. If their enemies had indeed developed effective weapons against divine beings, the protection they had offered their followers might prove illusory. Worse, the coordinated nature of the planned assault suggested a level of organization and commitment that went far beyond the Emperor's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain relevance. "Show me these weapons," Vera demanded, her voice carrying the authority of absolute judgment. "Let me examine the evidence and determine whether their capabilities match their claims." What Lysa had learned proved deeply troubling. The Alliance had indeed acquired artifacts from the ancient binding rituals, and their mages had apparently found ways to modify and amplify their effects. Most concerning was their recruitment of mortal practitioners who had learned divine techniques but turned them toward hostile purposes. Individuals who understood the principles of divine magic well enough to potentially corrupt or counter them. "They're using our own methods against us," Theron observed after reviewing the intelligence Lysa had gathered. "Teaching people to channel divine energy and then directing that energy toward destructive rather than creative ends. It's a perversion of everything we've tried to accomplish." The realization that their own teachings could be weaponized forced a fundamental reassessment of their approach. They had shared knowledge freely, trusting that exposure to divine principles would naturally lead people toward cooperation and peace. The possibility that those same principles could be deliberately corrupted and turned against their creators had not been adequately considered. "Perhaps," Nerida suggested quietly, "it is time to consider more direct action. Not revenge or dominion, but the kind of decisive intervention that ends threats before they can fully manifest." It was a seductive argument, particularly given the scale of what they faced. A coordinated assault by multiple kingdoms armed with divinity-killing weapons represented an existential threat not just to their movement but to the gods themselves. The old patterns of thought suggested that such threats demanded overwhelming response demonstration of divine power so terrible that no mortal would dare challenge them again. But Mira found herself thinking of the Emperor's ultimatum months earlier, of how they had chosen dialogue over dominance even when provoked. The principles that had guided them through that crisis remained valid now, even if the stakes had grown higher. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" she said slowly, working through the implications as she spoke. "What if this alliance isn't really about stopping us, but about proving that mortals can still challenge gods successfully? If we respond with overwhelming force, we validate their entire worldview about divine nature being fundamentally incompatible with mortal freedom." End quote. "But if we don't respond," Arion pointed out, "they may succeed in their goal of eradicating divine influence entirely. Our followers will be slaughtered, our teachings suppressed, and our own existence potentially ended." "Not if we find a third option," Mira replied, her conviction growing as the idea took shape. "Not overwhelming force or passive resistance, but something that exposes the fundamental weakness in their approach while protecting those who look to us for guidance." What she proposed was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of meeting the alliance's military might with divine power, they would meet it with absolute transparency. When the assault came, they would ensure that every action taken by both sides was visible to the entire world, broadcast through divine means to anyone willing to observe. "Let them attack sanctuary cities filled with families and children," Mira explained. "Let them use their divine killing weapons against gods who refuse to fight back. Let the world see what their final solution actually looks like when implemented. Either they'll be revealed as the aggressors they are, or they'll be forced to abandon their assault when faced with its moral implications." The plan was controversial even among their allies. It required them to trust that mortal observers would see the truth of what was happening and respond accordingly. It meant accepting real risks to their followers and themselves in service of a principle that their enemies might not share. Most challenging of all, it demanded that they maintain their commitment to nonviolence even in the face of genuine threats to their existence. "You're gambling everything on the assumption that mortals have evolved beyond their ancient capacity for fear and hatred," Celine warned. "What if you're wrong? What if the world watches you die and simply celebrates the end of divine interference in their affairs? Then we'll have failed," Mira acknowledged. "But we'll have failed while remaining true to what we claim to believe. If our principles can't survive contact with genuine opposition, then maybe they weren't worth preserving anyway." The vote was close, but ultimately the council chose to trust in the wisdom of Mira's strategy. Preparations began immediately for what would either vindicate their entire approach or result in its complete destruction. The coming confrontation would test not just their power, but their faith in the possibility of lasting change in the ancient patterns that had governed relations between divine and mortal realms. As news of the approaching assault spread through their network of communities and supporters, the response was both heartening and sobering. Many reaffirmed their commitment to the forest teachings and vowed to stand firm regardless of the consequences. Others, particularly those with families to protect, chose to distance themselves from any open association with divine influence. A few even joined the alliance's cause, convinced that the gods represented a genuine threat to mortal autonomy that needed to be eliminated. "Human nature in all its complexity," Vera observed with something approaching affection. "Brave and cowardly, loyal and faithless, wise and foolish all at once. This is what we've chosen to work with rather than rule over." The final weeks before the assault were spent in intensive preparation, but not the kind their enemies would expect. Instead of marshaling divine power for battle, the gods focused on ensuring that their message would survive regardless of what happened to them personally. Their teachings were recorded in forms that could not be easily destroyed, hidden in locations beyond mortal reach, and embedded in the consciousness of their most trusted followers. "If we fall," Arion told Lysa during one of their last private conversations, "the work must continue, not through worship or reverence for our memory, but through the living practice of the principles we've tried to embody. The partnership between divine and mortal cannot depend on any particular gods or mortals, it must become a natural expression of evolved consciousness. Lisa, now a woman of 30 with wisdom that belied her years, nodded with the gravity appropriate to such a charge. I understand. We've never been following you personally, but rather following the path you've shown us. If that path is true, it will remain true regardless of who walks it. The night before the assault was due to begin, the temple grounds were filled with an otherworldly calm that seemed to emanate from the gods themselves. They had made their choice and accepted its consequences, finding peace in the knowledge that they had remained faithful to their principles even when easier alternatives presented themselves. As dawn broke over the forest, the first sounds of approaching armies could be heard in the distance. The Alliance had indeed marshaled significant forces, tens of thousands of soldiers equipped with the latest weapons, and accompanied by mages who radiated confidence in their ability to bind or destroy divine entities. At their head rode High Inquisitor Valen, his banner proclaiming the Alliance's dedication to preserving mortal freedom from divine tyranny. But as the armies crested the final ridge before the Temple Valley, they found something they had not expected. The forest gods stood waiting in the open, making no attempt to hide or defend themselves. Around them were gathered not soldiers but families, men and women and children who had come to stand with their teachers and protectors, not as warriors but as witnesses to whatever would unfold. More surprising still was the presence of observers from across the known world. Scholars and priests, merchants and diplomats, even representatives from kingdoms that had officially supported the Alliance, all drawn by divine invitation to witness the confrontation that would determine the future of divine-mortal relations. High Inquisitor Valen rode forward alone, his expression troubled by the unexpected scene before him. Whatever he had planned for this moment, it had not included attacking defenseless families while the world watched. "This changes nothing," he declared, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "The Alliance demands your withdrawal from mortal affairs and the cessation of your corruption of human hearts and minds. Surrender now, and your followers will be permitted to return to their homes unharmed." "And if we refuse?" Mira asked, stepping forward to meet him in the space between the armies and the assembled communities. "Then we will do what must be done to preserve mortal sovereignty," Valen replied, but his gaze kept moving to the children who watched from behind their parents, to the observers who were recording every word, to the gods themselves who showed no sign of fear or hostility despite the overwhelming force arrayed against them. "Look around you," Mira said gently. "Look at what you're preparing to attack. Are these the actions of tyrants seeking dominion? Are these the communities of slaves cowering before divine masters? Or are these people who have chosen to follow teachings that make their lives better, that help them grow into more than they thought possible?" For a long moment, Valen stared at the scene before him, and something in his expression shifted. The absolute certainty that had driven him for so long began to crack as the reality of the situation penetrated his preconceptions. He was preparing to attack teachers and healers, to slaughter families whose only crime was believing that cooperation was possible between divine and mortal hearts. "You've planned for resistance," Arion observed, moving to stand beside Mira. "You've brought weapons and bindings designed to overcome divine power turned toward aggression. But what do you do when faced with gods who refuse to fight back? How do you justify destroying those who offer only love and healing?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but not the kind that could be answered with swords or sorcery. This was a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that had driven the Alliance's formation, a demand that they examine their own motivations and methods in the harsh light of reality. The moment of decision stretched on as thousands of observers waited to see what choice would be made. The armies remained poised for battle, but their leaders found themselves facing an enemy that refused to be one, a threat that offered only peace, a tyranny that demanded nothing but the freedom to serve. In the end, it was one of the Alliance commanders who broke the deadlock, dismounting his horse and walking slowly toward the assembled gods and their followers. His armor bore the insignia of a kingdom that had lost much to imperial collapse, and his face showed the weariness of a man who had seen too much war and suffering. "I came here to fight monsters," he said simply. "But I see only people, divine people, perhaps. but people nonetheless who want the same things we all want: peace, prosperity, the chance to raise children in safety and watch them grow into something better than we managed to become. He removed his helmet and let it fall to the ground. I will not raise my sword against such aspirations. His example proved catalytic. Other commanders began to step forward, laying down their weapons and declaring their unwillingness to participate in what increasingly looked like mass murder rather than legitimate warfare. The mages who had come prepared to bind gods found their certainty shaken by divine beings, who made no attempt to use their power offensively. Within hours, the great army that had come to end divine influence in mortal affairs had largely dissolved, its components either departing in confusion or actively switching sides to join those they had come to destroy. High Inquisitor Valen found himself commanding a force reduced to a few hundred fanatics, facing an audience of thousands who had witnessed the moral bankruptcy of his cause. "This is not over," he declared, his voice carrying desperation rather than authority. "The threat you represent remains real, regardless of your current peaceful facade. Divine power will always corrupt those who wield it, and mortal freedom will always be imperiled by the existence of gods." "Perhaps," Mira replied sadly, "perhaps you're right, and this experiment in cooperation will eventually fail as all such experiments have failed before. But wouldn't it be better to let it fail on its own merits rather than destroying it before we know what it might become?" The final confrontation came not with armies and weapons, but with a single man's desperate attempt to prove his worldview correct. Valen raised one of the ancient binding artifacts, its dark energies crackling with the power to imprison divine consciousness in eternal torment. The assembled observers gasped as he aimed it directly at Mira, the newest and presumably most vulnerable of the gods. "Let the world see what happens when divine power is truly threatened," he snarled. "Let them witness the rage and destruction that follows when gods are forced to defend themselves. This is what you really are beneath your peaceful facade." The artifact discharged its full power, sending tendrils of shadow and thorn toward Mira with enough force to bind a being of immense divine nature. But instead of defending herself or retaliating, Mira simply stood still and allowed the binding energies to strike her. The shadows wrapped around her like chains, the thorns pierced her divine flesh, and she fell to her knees under the weight of magical bindings designed to cause maximum suffering. Yet even as the artifact's power sought to drive her into the kind of rage that would justify Valen's fears, Mira's expression remained peaceful. Through her bond with Arion, she drew on his strength and memory, remembering how he had endured centuries of such torment without losing his essential nature. Through her connections to the other gods, she found the will to resist the artifact's psychological assault. And through her love for the community they had built together, she discovered that some bonds were stronger than any magical binding. "I forgive you," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the valley despite the pain that racked her divine form. "I understand your fear, and I forgive you for acting on it. You've spent your life fighting monsters, and when you look at us, monsters are what you see. But that's your burden to bear, not ours to validate." The words hit Valen harder than any divine retaliation could have. Here was a being he had just tortured with the most vicious weapons at his disposal. And instead of anger or threats of vengeance, she offered understanding and absolution. The cognitive dissonance was too much for his rigid worldview to accommodate. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No. You're supposed to be monsters. You're supposed to prove me right." He triggered the artifact again, pouring more binding energy into the magical chains that held Mira. "Show them what you really are. Show them the wrath of gods." The Mira's only response was to close her eyes and endure, her divine nature blazing brighter rather than darker under the assault. Around her, the other gods remained motionless, making no attempt to intervene despite their obvious ability to do so. They had chosen their path and would see it through to whatever end awaited them. It was the observers who finally acted. Mortals from a dozen different kingdoms moved forward as one, surrounding Valen and gently but firmly taking the binding artifact from his hands. They did not harm him. Violence would have contradicted everything they had just witnessed, but neither would they allow him to continue his assault on beings who refused to defend themselves. "Enough," said the commander who had first laid down his arms. You've proven nothing except your own inability to see beyond your fears. These gods have offered us partnership, and we've answered with weapons. They've shown us love, and we've responded with hatred. The monster in this valley isn't wearing divine form. As the binding energies dissipated and Mira struggled to her feet, supported by Arion's gentle hands, the assembled thousands began to understand what they had truly witnessed. This was not a confrontation between gods and mortals, but between different visions of what their relationship could become. The gods had offered one path: cooperation, mutual respect, growth through partnership. Their enemies had offered another: eternal suspicion, dominance through force, security through the destruction of anything they didn't understand. The choice between these visions was not one that could be made through warfare or coercion. It had to emerge from the free decision of conscious beings who understood both alternatives and their implications. By refusing to fight back, by accepting suffering rather than inflicting it, the gods had demonstrated that their way offered something genuinely different from the cycles of dominance and rebellion that had characterized divine-mortal relations throughout history. High Inquisitor Valen was led away by his few remaining supporters, a broken man whose entire purpose in life had been revealed as unnecessary. The armies dispersed peacefully, many of their members choosing to remain in the valley to learn more about the teachings they had come to destroy. The observers returned to their home countries with tales that would reshape how people thought about gods, power, and the possibilities for cooperation between different forms of consciousness. Though perhaps the most significant outcome was the quiet conversation that took place between Mira and Arion as they sat together beside the temple's sacred spring in the hours after the confrontation ended. The binding artifact had left its mark on Mira's divine essence, creating wounds that would heal but scars that would remain as permanent reminders of what they had endured and overcome. "Do you regret it?" Arion asked, his fingers tracing the silvered lines that now marked her skin where the thorns had pierced deepest. The choice to endure rather than resist? The decision to trust in mortal wisdom rather than divine power? Mira considered the question carefully, testing her emotions and convictions against the fresh memory of magical torment. What she found was not regret, but a deepening of her original certainty, a confirmation that they had chosen correctly even when the cost proved higher than expected. "I regret the necessity," she said finally. "I regret that fear runs so deep in mortal hearts that some people would rather destroy hope than risk disappointment. But I don't regret showing them that another way is possible, even if not everyone is ready to accept it." Around them, the work of rebuilding and growth continued. The temple communities welcomed new members who had been impressed by what they witnessed, while established practitioners deepened their understanding of the principles they had seen so dramatically demonstrated. The network of bridge builders expanded as more mortals chose to develop their own latent divine abilities, creating a growing population of individuals who embodied the partnership between realms rather than simply advocating for it. Years passed, and the events in the valley became legend, not the kind of myth that distorted truth through repetition, but the kind that preserved essential wisdom in forms that could be understood across cultures and generations. Children grew up hearing stories of gods who chose love over power, of mortals who chose understanding over fear, of the day when an ancient cycle of mutual destruction finally ended through the courage of those willing to try something new. The Meridian Empire never recovered from the collapse of its authority, eventually fragmenting into smaller kingdoms that governed through consent rather than coercion. Some of these successor states embraced the forest teachings wholeheartedly, while others maintained more traditional approaches to religion and governance. The diversity was welcomed rather than resisted. True partnership required the freedom to choose different paths, even paths that might prove mistaken. Other temples began appearing in distant lands as more gods emerged from their hiding places, inspired by the success of the forest experiment. Each brought their own perspective and methods to the growing movement, creating a rich tapestry of approaches to divine mortal cooperation. Some focused on healing and agriculture, others on knowledge and justice, still others on art and beauty and the celebration of life in all its forms. Baisa eventually established her own temple in the Eastern Kingdoms, becoming the first mortal to be granted full divine status through the consensus of the God Council rather than through transformation or inheritance. Her sanctuary became a training ground for those seeking to bridge the gap between realms, and her teachings emphasized the importance of maintaining human perspective, even while developing supernatural abilities. The goal is not to become gods, she would tell her students, but to help gods remember what it means to be mortal, and to help mortals discover what it means to be truly alive. The love between Mira and Arion deepened with each passing decade, their bond serving as both example and anchor for the growing community of divine beings working together. They learned to balance unity with individuality, to be truly one while remaining distinctly themselves, to love without possessing and support without controlling. Their story became central to the new mythology that grew up around the partnership movement, not worship in the traditional sense, but celebration of the idea that love could indeed bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle, transform any relationship if both parties were willing to choose growth over safety. On the 50th anniversary of Mira's first arrival in the forest, a great celebration was held that drew visitors from every corner of the known world. Kings and farmers, scholars and craftsmen, priests and skeptics all came together to witness what had grown from one desperate woman's love for her dying sister. The heart's truth flowers that had marked the beginning of Mira and Arion's love had multiplied across the forest, their silver light now bright enough to be seen from miles away. They served as a living symbol of the truth that had made everything possible, that love freely given and received could create something greater than either lover could achieve alone. As the celebration reached its peak, with music and laughter echoing through the ancient trees, Mira found herself thinking of that frightened young woman who had carried her sister through the darkness so many years ago. That woman had known nothing of gods or magic, of the complexities of divine politics, or the challenges of building new forms of civilization. She had known only that love demanded action, that hope required courage, and that some risks were worth taking regardless of the potential cost. She would be amazed, don't you think? Arion said, following her thoughts through their ever-present bond. That desperate girl who broke into a cursed forest, if she could see what grew from her simple act of love? She would be proud, Mira replied with certainty. Not of the power or the recognition or the grand historical significance, but of the fact that Lysa lived and thrived and became everything she was capable of becoming. That was all she ever really wanted. And in that moment, surrounded by the celebration of everything they had built together, Mira understood that the girl who had entered the forest seeking a miracle had found something even better, the chance to become the miracle. Herself. To transform not just her own life, but the very nature of what was possible between loving hearts. The forest sang around them as night fell, and the heart's truth flowers blazed like captured stars. Their light a beacon visible to travelers still lost in darkness, still searching for proof that love could indeed conquer all obstacles and bridge any divide. In that light, gods and mortals danced together as equals, partners in the eternal work of creating something beautiful from the raw materials of hope and courage, and the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over all fear. The future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten song, full of challenges yet to be faced and wonders yet to be discovered. There would be setbacks and failures, moments of doubt and times when the old patterns of dominance and submission would reassert themselves in new forms. But there would also be triumphs and breakthroughs, instances of grace that would remind everyone why the work mattered. Examples of what became possible when conscious beings chose cooperation over competition, understanding over judgment, love over everything else. In the end, that was what Mira had found in the cursed forest, not just a sleeping god who could heal her sister, but a sleeping possibility within herself and all conscious beings to become more than they had ever imagined possible. The forest had never been cursed at all, only waiting for someone brave enough to see past surface appearances to the infinite potential that lay beneath. The love that had awakened between Mira and Arion became the seed from which a new world grew, one relationship at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. And though the full flowering of that world lay generations in the future, its foundations were solid and its promise real, built on the simple truth that love freely chosen, courageously maintained, and generously shared freely could change everything. As the celebration continued around them and the years stretched ahead like an infinite invitation to keep growing, Mira took Arion's hand and smiled at the wonder of it all. She had gone into the forest seeking to save one life, and had found the secret to transforming countless others. She had awakened a sleeping god and discovered that the greatest magic was not power over others, but the courage to remain vulnerable in a world that often rewarded hardness, to choose love in a universe that sometimes seemed designed to break hearts. In that choice, repeated daily by thousands of individuals across the growing network of communities, lay the true miracle, not the supernatural abilities or divine interventions, but the simple, radical act of believing that things could be different, that people could change. That love really was stronger than fear, and hope more powerful than despair. The story would continue long after Mira and Arion had passed into legend, carried forward by those who had learned that the most important magic was the kind that happened when conscious beings chose to see the best in each other and work together towards something greater than either could achieve alone. It was a lesson written in silver light across a forest that had never been cursed, only waiting for someone with enough love in her heart to recognize the sleeping god who had always been there, dreaming of the day when such love would finally set him free.